Hello, everyone, and welcome once again to the Cave to the Cross Apologetics, where we go out of the cave of Plato and understand that we were saved by the cross, and that's the road that we're currently taking. I'm Patrick.
And I'm Tony.
And if you need to get a hold of us on any of the social media platforms, that's all included in the links below. But caveofthecross.com is our main site to go to, and from there you can find us on the YouTubes and the Stitchers and the iTunes and Facebooks and whatever else is out there. Twitter, we even Twitter. Mostly I Twitter and make snarky remarks on there. So those are places where you can go to and check us out. But today we're continuing on. For you, it's been a week. For us, it's just been a few seconds, and we wanted to get the big push out of the way for presuppositional apologetics, because that's kind of our underlying model for meeting as this book club, and we're inviting you along. But we're in the yes or no chapter for Jason Lyle's Keeping Faith in the Age of Reason, and we just kind of started out in this chapter, but we're going to continue on with the questions. So I think we're at number 305.
Yeah. This one says, can God do anything? Right? That's the question for this one. And then there are several passages that are listed that seem to indicate that he can. And then there are several passages that are listed that seem to indicate that God cannot do anything.
Yeah.
So the issue here is, can God do anything? Right?
This is the old classic, can God make a rock so heavy that he himself could not lift it? Or if you've ever watched The Simpsons, can God make a burrito so hot that he himself cannot eat it? So it depends on which one you grew up with. I grew up with The Simpsons one, so that's the one.
Yeah.
So there are a number of verses here that make the claim that yes, he can do anything, and then also no. I think we kind of assume, because God is God, that he can do anything, and those are found in places like Genesis 18:14. Is anything too hard for the Lord? At the appointed time, I will return to you about this time next year, and Sarah will have a son. Obviously, the question is left unanswered, because of course the answer is no. There's nothing that
Right.
God cannot do.
Right. The answer, it's an assumption that no, God can do anything.
Yeah, and that's clearly made when he returns and Sarah's pregnant. Job 42, 1-2. Then Job answered the Lord and said, I know that you can do all things, and that no purpose of yours can be thwarted. So that seems like a pretty firm statement.
That's straightforward, right?
And
Yeah.
Job should know. But in the book of Judges and Mark and Hebrews, it says this for Judges 1:19, and the Lord was with Judah, and he took possession of the hill country, but he could not drive out the inhabitants of the plain, because they had chariots of iron. Mark 6:5, and he could not, meaning Jesus, could do no mighty work there, except that he had laid his hands on a few sick people and healed them. And Hebrews 6:18 says, so that by two unchangeable things in which it is impossible for God to lie. So there it says it's impossible for God. We who have fled for refuge might have strong encouragement to hold fast to the hope set before us. So it seems like contradictions, at least on face value.
Yeah. So the issue that Dr. Lyle here points out is what he calls the equivocation fallacy.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So you're using the word in two different ways here. Yeah. Anything can...
The word anything.
Anything,
yeah.
Right. So anything can mean any actual thing that's logically possible, he mentions, or it can mean anything including hypothetical absurdities or contradictions, right? Like gobbledygook or supercalifragilisticexpialidocious. Can God do that, right?
Yes. Mary Poppins can, God can.
Yeah.
Things like, can you have a circle with edges? Or a square circle is another one.
Yeah, a married bachelor. There you go.
Yeah. Yep.
Can God make one of those?
Yeah.
Right. So the idea here is God can do anything, notice, that is logically possible.
Mm-hmm.
That's the idea, right? Anything that is in line with, that's consistent with his nature. So, can God do, gobbledygook, meaningless things, that don't have any, a square circle it's a meaningless thing in the language, right? And so God cannot be inconsistent with his character. He is reason. We reason because God is a reasoning person, and so he doesn't do things that are, number one, inconsistent with its character, and secondly, things that are logically inconsistent, that is, that they are meaningless. us, right? So no, God cannot do those types of things.
So things like miracles, parting of the Red Sea, the virgin birth, healings, earthquakes.
So they violate the laws of nature, but they're not meaningless or illogical type of things, right?
Right. There is the ability for God to step into creation and make physical changes. Hold the sun in the sky so that a battle can occur for another day with sunlight occurring. There's no logical contradiction there. We might say that it's impossible, but it's impossible in the sense that these aren't the normal events that should occur.
Right.
But this isn't God making a rock so heavy he himself cannot lift it, having the laws of logic violated. God can't put a car out of the garage and have it be in the garage at the same time, unless if it's a trick of the light or something with an explanation where it doesn't violate how God thinks or how God acts, like
or his character.
In Hebrews 6:18, it's impossible for God to lie. That's a great thing to know. In fact, that's one of the big things that the Judeo-Christian God, the biblical God, has over, let's say, like the Allah, who is so above his own word that he himself could violate it. And so how do we know that salvation is possible in how Muslims claim that you reach salvation if God can, at the 11th hour or right before you die, or not tell you, comes about and we were supposed to eat 12 chickens before we died.
For that particular religious tradition, right, God's will is the operative thing.
Mm-hmm.
What the scriptures teach, the Bible teaches, is that God's character determines what he does, not necessarily his will. His will is just an outworking of what he desires to do with regard to his character. So God's character is that he is truth, right? God is truth, and so he cannot lie. So as a result of that, obviously, lying has to do with not something that's not truthful. God cannot do that because his character dictates that, and so he can't violate his character. So we can trust, then, we know that God says, if you believe in the Lord Jesus Christ and thou shalt be saved, we can trust him to keep his word when he says that.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So, equivocation on the word anything. What do you mean by anything? Does it mean anything that's just anything, whether it's logically contradictory or whatever? Or do you mean something that is in principle possible to do? Well, in principle possible to do is what we're talking about here. Like raising the dead. It's in principle possible for God to do because he is all powerful.
Or saving dead men to life.
Yeah, bring people back. Yeah, bring people to life because of his salvation efforts. All right, so that's so yes, God can do anything, or no, God cannot do anything, depending on what you mean by anything.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
In similar fashion, 308 asks, is God the author of confusion? Genesis 11:7-9 and 1 Corinthians 1:27 indicates that he is. However, in the same book of Corinthians, 14:33 states he is not. So Genesis 11 is about God coming down and confusing language at the Tower of Babel. 1 Corinthians 1:27 says, but God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what was weak in the world to shame the strong. The whole first chapter there is great, and I would actually say that's a presuppositional touchstone that I've actually taught on for chapter 1, talking about God using the crosses as to various people as kind of a stumbling block, but choosing it so that people don't just kind of think that they happen to stumble upon it. That's something that has to happen within someone's heart in order to change them. But that's getting off on a free sermon. Then there you go. But 1 Corinthians 14:33, which is what they're saying is the he's not the author of confusion, states that, for God is not the author of confusion, but of peace, as in all the churches of the saints.
So in one hand, in the book of Genesis, chapter 11, God confuses the language, and therefore he seems to be the author of confusion. But in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 27, it says specifically, explicitly, that God is not the author of confusion. So which is it?
Yes.
Actually, that was 1 Corinthians 14.
14 is where he's not a
Not
author of confusion.
the author of confusion.
Right. So Lyle calls this the specious reasoning, and goes on to say that God clearly approves of order and peace, and I think that's clear from what we get from the Old and New Testament. But does this mean that God is not able to bring confusion or destruction to those who rebel against him? And we see this in a number of times, including King David, where he allows Satan to go and tempt him into having a census that God didn't command. And so there David was relying on kind of the strength of the will of the people to kind of puff himself up and,
the number of the people, the strength of the number.
Make him kind of be in awe in the number, which Gideon's story should tell us that, you can have 300
numbers
guys.
don't matter,
right?
Yeah,
they really don't. So
God and any number is a majority,
right. Moses lifting up his hands until he needs help to hold it up, and that's what causes the army to advance or retreat. But just as God is a God of peace, he can bring war and destruction upon those who are evil. He can judge, and that's the thing. He's not only a God of peace, a God of order, but he's also a just God, a judging God. And it's one of those things where it's depending on what you're talking about, and it's not actually God kind of doing it himself. He's not going out there and taking the armies and throwing them at them. He's decreeing it by his own declarative nature, but it's within the context of people's actions that they would want to do. So that's why he's able to use the Assyrians and also judge them, because the Assyrians would go out and attack the people of God and put them into subjection.
Yeah, good. So is God the author of confusion? No, he's not.
No, but he's able to bring it about through various means.
Okay. The next one is 3:11, right?
Yep.
All right. So this is kind of an interesting one, and this is one that should be familiar to all of us here. And most of us would have a ready answer to this
Sure.
one, right?
Yeah.
The question here is, how did David kill Goliath, right? So think about that. How did David kill Goliath, right? Well, notice in 1 Samuel 17 and following, it says that David killed Goliath without a sword. But in 1 Samuel, later on in the chapter, of just a verse or two later, it says that David did so with a sword. So how did David kill Goliath?
Right. Well, and I was just reading my daughter the story of David and Goliath, and it ended and he picked up a stone and threw it at Goliath, and that killed Goliath. And I had to go, wait, I read something about this.
Yeah.
And it was actually right. It's verse. I mean, we're in the same chapter. We're a verse later, and this is an odd thing. So starting in verse 49, it's the familiar story that we kind of all know, is that David put his hand in the bag, took out a stone, slung it at the Philistine on his forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the ground. So David prevailed over the Philistine. So again, this is verse 50. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and with a stone, and struck the Philistine and killed him. There was no sword in the hand of David, because why? Because he was...
Because he had stones and a sling.
And Saul even tried to give him his own, shield and sword, and it was just too heavy for this.
Yeah, that's not what he was used to, right? I'll fight in my own way, and not your clunky stuff.
He killed a lion and a bear and saved the sheep just from his sling. So there was no sword that he had, but then David ran and stood over the Philistine, took his sword, drew it out of its sheath, killed him, and cut off his head with it. When the Philistines saw the champion was dead, they fled. In fact, I forget where else it talks about, but the sword actually is hung up in David's house, and it's kind of a well-known conversational piece that David has when he has people over.
Right. So technically, we would say, in fact, what the scriptures seem to indicate is that he put Goliath down with the stone, right? But then the cutting off of his head was when we say he killed him. Right?
If you were being fair, you could ask this question and say, well, it seems like in verse 50 it says it struck him and he killed him, where then a verse later it talks about him cutting off his head with a sword. But I don't honestly think that this list of questions is being generous with wanting the answers that's there. But it's this pause in verse 50 that says, so David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and with a stone and struck the Philistine and killed him. It's kind of a new thought to kind of summarize what the events took place in summary, and then adds at the very end, how the final death knell came to Goliath.
Right. So he hit him with the stone, and he went to the ground. That's what verse 49 says, right? And then verse 50 then is a summary of everything that happened, right? He hit him with a stone and struck him, and he killed him. And then the rest of verse 50 and verse 51 explains how he killed him. He killed him once he put him down with the sword.
It would be like pausing in a story and say, David slung the rock and that's all that killed him. Well, let me tell you the rest of it. He actually picked up a sword because he didn't have one and cut off his head. Right, so it's kind of a pause within the story and then the summary.
Right. So Lyle suggests that to say that this is a contradiction is specious reasoning, right? And he says the order in which events are mentioned is not necessarily the order in which they occur, right? And so that's why we see this distinction here between 50 and 51.
Right. And also, let's stop equating us with David and our problems with Goliath, and let's understand that David is a precursor to Christ, and we need to stop writing books about how we have to slay our giants in our life. Let's just stop with it. There's way too many of them, and they're all awful.
Yeah, and we have a problem. Do we pick up stones or do we pick up swords? Right?
Yeah, there you go.
All right, 3:12. What's that one?
So it kind of goes back to our earliest ancestors, Adam and Eve, and asks the question: did Adam die on the day he ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil? 2:17 says yes of Genesis, while 3:6 and 5:5 say no. The main crux to the confusion here seems to be from Genesis 2:17. But of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in that day that you eat of it you shall surely die. And then afterwards we understand that they eat of the fruit of the tree, and that Adam lives to a ripe old age of 930 years old, and then he dies. So what's going on here? He ate from the food and he didn't die. Surely he didn't.
Yeah.
And don't call me Shirley.
Yeah. Okay, Shirley. So Lyle points out here that this is a failure to read the text carefully, right? And he says this is a common state. The Bible not only does not actually state that Adam would die instantly or on the day. It just says in the day, right, that he would die when he ate the fruit. And so the word surely here, surely, you shall surely die, he points out, is an important qualifier. And it's a good way to translate a difficult Hebrew phrase, which is most literally rendered, dying you shall die. Yeah. Dying you shall die, right? So, yes, the Hebrew word die is used twice, indicating the certainty of it. It's not the death that would occur on that day, but rather death became certain and unavoidable on the day that he ate. So this, again, on the day that you eat, you shall surely die. Dying, you shall die, right? Mm-hmm. So one way to explain this, and I think a good way to explain this, is we might say that in terms of spiritually, he died. And then later on, and he physically died.
Yeah, there were many changes that resulted from the fall. Yeah. Physically, emotionally, spiritually, obviously, all those things. I mean, the entire creation groans out because of that simple act that changes everything. It turns, plants from having no spines or spindles and thorns and everything like that. It turns plant-eating based animals to carnivores. I mean, it causes people to deteriorate. They're in the process
and the
of
earth to
dying.
deteriorate.
Yeah, I mean, it's a sad fact to say when children are first born, they're starting their life, but at the same time they're starting their death march, because 10 out of 10 people don't get out of this world alive, and we shouldn't take it that seriously then.
But so the idea of dying, it has to do with separation, right? Physical death is the separation of the kind of the spirit from the body, right? They're ripped apart. And spiritual death, that's what makes it so agonizing. Spiritual death, really, Adam had a certain type of relationship with God that then was ripped apart, as a result of this particular sin. And so he died spiritually, we might say, immediately, and then we see the consequences of that in his physical death later on.
Yeah, well, and we see kind of the reverse of that, but in the same tearing that we see when Christ dies, the veil of the temple, which is kind of the separation between man and God being torn from the top down. So there you even have a rending of the separation that occurs in Adam, but instead God takes death and rends it out of the hands of.
So he destroys that separation, right? He rents it apart, and now he allows us to have that same kind of relationship, the spiritual relationship that Adam had originally. We're allowed to have that as a result of the sacrifice of Christ.
Yeah, there's a lot of good parallels that we see, and I was just reading a good book by G.K. Beale talking about showing here's the job that Adam did in the garden, and what that meant as him being the first priest and the first kind of gardener, and what that all meant, and how Christ comes to fulfill it. It was a really interesting read.
Yeah, and so Lyle points out that Adam's death was assured on the day that he ate. Perhaps, he says, a good paraphrase into modern English would be, on the very day you ate of it, you will become mortal, right? And so therefore you will eventually die, right? Something like that. So no contradiction there. Sorry, critic. All right, 3:16 says, is the next one that we want to take a look at here.
Number 3:16.
3:16, right? Yeah.
That's right.
And it says, does God desire animal sacrifice? Well, yes, right? According to Genesis 4:4 and various other passages in Genesis, as well as passages in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy.
Yeah.
In fact, most of us always say, well, how? That's clear, However, no, God does not desire animal sacrifices. According to passages in the book of Psalms, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Micah, and Matthew. So which is it? Does God desire sacrifices, or doesn't he? So it might be helpful for us to at least be familiar with some of these passages so that we can understand what the issues is here.
So clearly, when Moses came about, saved the Hebrews, he's given the ceremonial law in order to have blood sacrifices, animal sacrifices, and those are why he references Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, because that's the giving of the law. And so I won't read that because those are kind of the known ones. But as far as the no portion of it, a number of them stood out as interesting. Psalms 46, in sacrifice and offering you have not delighted, but you have given me an open ear. Burnt offerings and sin offerings you have not required. Isaiah 1:11, what to me is the multitude of your sacrifices, says Yahweh. I have had enough of burnt offerings of rams and of fats of well-fed beasts. I do not delight in the blood of bulls or of lambs or of goats. That seems like he's not liking the sacrifices there. And skipping to the New Testament, 9:13 of Matthew says, go and learn what it means. I desire mercy and not sacrifice, for I came not to call the righteous, but sinners.
Yeah, so what's going on here is clearly sacrifices God uses as a covering for sin, right? the wages of sin is death, right? Without the shedding of blood, sins can't be forgiven. And so sacrifices was a picture of what he was going to ultimately do with his son Jesus Christ. So he uses those as a covering for sin. And so, yes, we might say he did desire sacrifices. He commanded sacrifices. In fact, that's the point that Lyle makes here. He says, failure to read the text carefully, God does not desire animal sacrifices in itself, right? But as a way, rather, he delights in obedience and right motives. He gave the Israelites ceremonial laws regarding animal sacrifices to teach them about blood atonement and to foreshadow Christ, right? So that's the idea. Now, one thing that we want to clear up here is with regard to the various laws that we see, especially in the Old Testament, right? There were ceremonial laws that had to do with how they were to worship, and often these were, as he says here, foreshadowings of Christ. There were civil laws and there were moral laws. The civil laws was for the nation of Israel as a theocracy, how they should be governed. So that's different from a ceremonial law, right? And of course, there was the moral law, which is the Ten Commandments, how they were to the standard for right and wrong, right? So those are the at least three kinds of laws that we are aware of when we look at the Old Testament.
Right. So when you have questions like, do you still eat shellfish or pork, or do you have clothes with mixed fibers, or those type of questions that people kind of like to throw out, it's a failure to distinguish between different types, and it's ceremonial law that some of them tend to fall into civil law as well. You could probably have argumentation depending on what exactly you're talking about. The moral law tends to be, yes, those things that won't change, those things calling murder wrong, or lying, or honoring your parents, or taking God's name in vain. Those are the things that that aren't dependent on time or place, where the other ones are. And that's where you have kind of the bigger benefit of Christianity from especially modern day Judaism is the ceremonial laws point towards Christ, and so we can look back and say these sacrifices here point towards Christ's atoning sacrifice here, and there are definitely a number of books out there that help you see Christ in the Old Testament. And without that understanding, you have modern Judaism turning things like the coming Messiah and it being the Savior of the world and an atoning sacrifice taken out of kind of context, and instead they put Israel into itself, and so it tends to work bad hermeneutically, but it's kind of they're still waiting patiently for Messiah, and you don't have too many Messianic Jews still around, although the way that they kind of work it into is by saying, it's the Messiah is just this bigger symbol for Judaism.
Yeah, right. So God, so the question is, and then God, did he desire the animal sacrifices? Well, yes, but that was a precursor to Christ. It was a foreshadowing of Christ. And when they did them improperly, because what he really desired was their obedient worship, right? When they did those improperly, then of course if they did them with wrong motives or ways that were contrary to his word, then he didn't want them to do it, right?
And understanding too that Israel was supposed to be this set apart, separate people, so that's why you have things like don't make any cuttings of flesh in your skin, because that's what pagans do, or don't worship in the high places because that's what the pagans do, or don't mix your clothes with different fibers, because it was that drastic separating yourself.
Don't offer your kids to Moloch.
That's a big one too. Yeah. You if you continue to do that, which unfortunately they did, you tend to run out of generations, and so you have everything pointing to a future sacrifice in Christ, but also a future people, and that's why you have the book of Romans talking about how not everyone who is of the tribe of Abraham is a true follower of God. So that we're called to we're called to be that separated people apart from the world, and that's clear in the letters of Paul. So,
and then the other question is, why don't we sacrifice this today as a command? Well, because Christ, Paul says, is the end of the law.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, he fulfilled the ceremonial portion of the law. Actually, he fulfilled the moral standards of the law, so that he could be the perfect sacrifice for us, so that his righteousness now can be attributed and counted unto us as righteousness, and our sin was put on Christ on the cross. And so there's this transaction that we as believers partake of when we trust that what God accomplished in Jesus Christ died on the cross.
Yeah. So it's important. It's one of the reasons why we can't do what certain modern preachers do and want to divorce the Old Testament from the New Testament, because so much of it is dependent on the Old Testament. You have things like the words of the apostles going back to the Old Testament. You have the letters from Paul speaking so much about Old Testament and using Old Testament words. Even the Romans road that most people kind of know, most of those verses are just lifted out of the Old Testament and are supplanted in Paul's big doctrinal statement in Romans. So we can't divorce what people would think. Oh, here's the trip up questions. Well, no, we can't do that, because it's not two different gods like certain people claimed and are heretically claiming, and we can't divorce it because it's part of the history that leads up to the point. It shows how people were saved by believing in the future coming Messiah in the Old Testament. That's how the Old Testament saints were saved. And so we look back upon the cross and say that one sacrifice, Christ died for all those who would believe in him. And so that ultimate point in history is phenomenal, and we can't just throw the baby out or the bathwater, because they're all important, even though they're a little messy and muddy, and they don't always put people in the appropriate light. But that's a good thing, because then I can not feel so bad for myself when I don't live a perfect life, and I can then fall,
confess it, repent from it, and realize that it shows who I am. Who I would be without Christ, even worse. Right. Yeah. All right. Well, we're getting on here in our time here. Do we want to try to tackle one more before we call it a day here, or do we want to?
I think we can probably leave the next ones for later. I think they'll fall right into the next ones. So, we thank you for joining us on this one, and I believe this is, episode 14. Yeah. So, cavetotthecross.com/EPs14. And then, of course, all the links below will tell you where to get everything else. So, thank you, and enjoy your week.